Tonight, we're at a tipping point. A war now in its fourth week almost, one that no parliament authorized. A president tweets ultimatums, then claims he's negotiating, while Tehran says otherwise. Former President Bill Clinton warns we are breaking things inside our own democracy that are very hard to put back together. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz, a global chokehold, remains in peril, and Iran proves it can strike 4,000 kilometers from home. The United States is crumbling, turning to Venezuelan oil, the very regime it once tried to overthrow. Guy Debord might call it a theater of simulacra. You might smile at the irony if bombs weren't still falling. So, why this war and why now? We'll talk about it shortly. Hello there and welcome to All 24 News special coverage, and for the latest on the ground, the diplomatic contradictions and the economic fallout, we turn to our own Zahra Farjani in this report and then we come back.
After 24 days of conflict with Iran, the United States is now beginning to confront the broader repercussions of the war. President Donald Trump announced that Washington has engaged in what he described as strong talks with Iran, revealing that both sides share major points of agreement.
So we are now having really good discussions. They started last night, a little bit, the night before that, and I think they're very good. They want peace. They've agreed they will not have a nuclear weapon, et cetera, et cetera. But we'll see what happens. I think there's a very good chance we're going to end up in a deal. And so we're giving it 5 days, and then we're going to see where that takes us. And I would say at the end of this period, I think it could very well end up being a very good deal.
However, despite the optimistic tone, Trump warned that failure to reach an agreement could result in renewed bombing, highlighting the fragile balance between diplomacy and military escalation. Tehran, meanwhile, has categorically rejected these claims. Iran's foreign ministry stated that no talks have taken place with Washington, describing Trump's remarks as an attempt to influence energy markets and buy time for potential military plans. A source cited by Iranian media stressed that while regional initiatives to de-escalate tensions do exist, Iran maintains that the United States must take responsibility for dialogue, as Tehran did not start the war. Adding to the denial, Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf dismissed reports of negotiations as false news.
No negotiations have been held with the US, and fake news is used to manipulate the financial and oil markets and escape the quagmire in which the US and Israel are trapped.
As contradictory narratives persist, regional mediators continue efforts to contain the crisis amid growing global concerns over energy security and the risk of a broader conflict.
And to dissect this moment where geopolitics, international law, and the global economy collide, we are joined by an exceptional panel of guests via video conference. In Washington, D.C. is Mr. Eugene Chasovsky, a geopolitical analyst and senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Thank you, Mr. Chasovsky, for honoring our invitation.
Thank you.
And from California, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean at California State University, Dominguez hails Los Angeles, an expert on international legitimacy and the political dynamics of the region. Hello, Professor, and thank you for agreeing to be with us tonight.
Our pleasure, Karim, always.
Thank you indeed. And from Genoa, Italy, is Mr. Mark Lowe, a corporate and geopolitical risk analyst who has been tracking energy markets and supply chain fragility. A pleasure to have you with us again, Mr. Mark Lowe.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be with you and your guests and your viewers, Karim.
Thank you indeed. And joining us from the UK is Mr. Mick Napier, a human rights activist and Middle East commentator. Thank you indeed for accepting our invitation, Mr. Mick.
Thank you for having me. You guys are real journalists. Very rare where I live.
Thank you indeed. So let's start the debate with you, Mr. Chesovsky. Former President Clinton said a sitting president is drawing a red line on social media that could affect 90 million civilians and send oil past $150 a barrel without a congressional vote. The House tried to pass a war powers resolution on March 4th, yet it failed. The Senate tried on March 18th, then the Republicans blocked it. How do you read this? And when a former president has to remind the nation how constitutional democracy works, is that a sign that American institutions are about to collapse under such practices?
So I wouldn't go so far as to say that American institutions are about to collapse, but clearly what we're seeing out of the Trump administration is, pushing the boundaries of those institutions, whether that's, over domestic reasons, political, economic insecurity. And of course, we're seeing this, in military interventions abroad as well. I will note that, President Trump is not the only president to pursue military operations without prior congressional approval. In fact, it's happened, quite a few times, over the last century or so. However, this is obviously a very significant moment, one that at least the Democratic Party has tried to spearhead in terms of scaling back that ability from the Trump administration. But of course, controlling both the House and the Senate right now, the Trump administration has been able to push forward with those plans. So certainly pushing the boundaries, certainly testing those institutions. I wouldn't say that we're on the verge of a collapse by any moment. This was, of course, a former president, and that's certainly within former President Clinton's right to comment on these types of things, as we've seen with other presidents in the past. But certainly we're at a very unique and challenging moment right now, both within the U.S. and abroad.
Mm-hmm. But then how would the public opinion see this, Mr. Chesovsky, the average American voter, when they see such a very important decision being taken without the congressional consent?
Well, certainly this is not a popular opinion right now. I think that's more from what we've seen in terms of the aftermath of the conflict, or as it continues to rage on. And obviously it's having the economic impact here in the US and of course globally as well. So that is certainly an unpopular outcome, and one that I think most of the population would want to see wrapped up sooner rather than later. But I think there's many different factors in terms of driving the popularity. I'll note, for example, the U.S. intervention in Venezuela just a couple of months ago was seen, also suspiciously, but because it was in a much shorter time frame and it was, relatively cleaner, so to speak, then you didn't have some of the issues that we're seeing, in terms of the popularity of the conflict right now. So certainly very challenging, but I think one that's more about the results than the nature in which it happened.
Thank you indeed. And Dr. Hamoud Salhi, how do you read this situation yourself?
I think almost was our guests just showed. Just a few basic facts. Since World War II, we had 14 presidents who launched initiative like this, launched conflict, got the United States into areas of hostilities. All of them, except Trump, reported the incident or the war or the conflict to Congress, but none of them have requested authorization. The authorization is required by the War Power Resolution Act. Clinton himself did not get the authorization. He bombarded or used the American forces to bombard Serbia for 78 days in Serbia without congressional approval. He used the ambiguity to stay there. The House of Representatives, for example, refused to approve to authorize the war, but he did not cut the funding for the war. So he played on that ambiguity. This is part of the American system, and it's an issue that lies at the core of the distribution of power between the Supreme Court or the the judiciary and the executive. Every American president who has engaged in this conflict like this, particularly after the War Power Resolution Act passed in early 70s, when informed the Congress, they all began with the statement that they are doing this on their own, and in their attempt to be transparent, if we are to use this term, with the judiciary, the American people, the Congress. But they never, and they took that action on the basis that this is well within their powers. And that continues. So Trump is not he's not new in this. He perhaps is taking it a little bit further by doing what he did, number one, in Venezuela, and second, what he's doing now. But this is not unfamiliar territory for the American people, and for that matter, for the Congress.
Mm-hmm. And but what about the ultimatum, Dr. Hamoud Salhi? We are hearing these reports that Donald Trump gave a 5-day, let's say, truce until they reach some kind of a negotiating, solution. But then the same reports suggest that the Zionist entity was not consulted on that. It was not even informed. What can that tell us about this alliance between the U.S. and the State of Israel?
I think that alliance is still in good health, and I doubted that the American president did not let Israeli prime minister know what he's doing, but that's irrelevant. I think the fact, the timing of this and the 5 days is very significant here. The declaration or the tweet went just before the stock market opened. And this, whatever you call it, this pause will be for 5 days. So it's from Monday to Friday. The idea there is to allow, for example, for the oil prices to de-escalate or to be less than what they are now, because so from that perspective, this is a tactical move. What we know of President Trump, and the Iranians are very, very clear on this, and they seem to have caught this very nicely. Look at what's happening around. It is very clear that the President Trump may have been reminded of what, if we go a little bit history, in 1956, when the Great Britain, Israel, and France decided to take control of the Suez, because President Gamal Abdel Nasser at the time nationalized it, and the reaction of the late President Gamal Abdel Nasser was, at the time when all his artillery, he was defeated. There was nothing for him to defend the canal. But what he did is that brought some old planes, got some big rocks, and threw it in the canal, and it's practically destroyed it made it unmanageable. So there was no way for that straightway to be used. It's basically destroyed the canal. And what that meant, it has a huge repercussion on what was perceived as a control of the canal, now is a major defeat, and it would later on affect the sterling currency. Britain would reach out to borrow money to make up for all the expense that it did. And I think that's where it was going. The Americans are preparing for that, what we call limited territorial control of the island, Haq, and also the Hormuz. But they realized, President Trump may have realized, that this is putting the world into jeopardy, and that the Iranians have the tools and the mean to turn what they think as a victory to a major defeat. And that's where he came in. So whether we are, and I think the plan is to use this 5 days to plan better, to prepare whatever he's doing in order to launch another attempt. Short of any other suggestion, Donald Trump, the way he has been thinking, this is a pause for him to, number one, save the market from the collapse in the oil down, and buy time to launch what he thinks he needs to do.
So it's more of a strategic shift, let's say. All right.
It's a tactical move.
Thank you indeed. So let's include Mr. Mark Lowe, since you mentioned oil prices and energy prices in general. Mr. Mark Lowe, we have reports in a remarkable twist saying that to absorb the shock of this war, the U.S. is now using Venezuelan oil, the very regime it has sanctioned and tried to overthrow. So Washington wages war against Iran for the sake of a foreign ally, while simultaneously bailing out its own economy by making a deal with a socialist government in Latin America. Now, some observers would ask that doesn't this expose the entire maximum pressure doctrine as a complete farce? And what does it tell Russia, China, and North Korea about American credibility?
Well, it's tempting to call it a farce, Karim, and unfortunately also very easy to do so. But I think that we have to reason more than a farce. We have to reason in terms of realpolitik, albeit realpolitik determined by desperation rather than an actual plan. I mean, generally, sanctions are not moral positions. They're instruments of pressure. And as such, these are instruments that can be adjusted when circumstances change. So what this episode does show us is that the energy security overrides ideological consistency when the stakes are high enough. It also shows us that, surprise, surprise, that which was very, very easy to forecast seems to have come as something as a surprise, and that is, to say the very, very least, clamorous. Anyway, all that said, there is a cost. I mean, for countries like Russia, China, North Korea, this reinforces the perception that US policy can change, can shift very, very quickly when under pressure. Now, that doesn't necessarily make the USA weak, but it does make the USA, at least under this administration, far more predictable in one sense in particular. And it's that which Iran is certainly learning. If you create enough disruption, basically Washington will recalibrate. And, looking towards the future and looking towards other theaters and looking at other countries, this has very serious long-term implications for any form of deterrence. All of a sudden, you prove to be inconsistent and you prove to be very, very fast in changing policies when all of a sudden you realize that you are out of your depth. So the lesson, and here I'll close, the lesson here is that the more disruption is created, the greater the advantage to anybody who is in any form in contrast with the United States of America.
But then, since I asked you about the position of Russia, China, and North Korea, now we have these reports saying that Russia is warning against strikes on Bushehr nuclear facility, setting it as a red line for both the United States and the Zionist entity. And at the same time, Russia said as well that killing Iranian commanders will not go unanswered. What can we consider this? Some kind of a threat or a prediction, Mr. Monklow?
Well, at some point in time, Russia had to comment on something. So Russia is very, very much commenting on that, which is the most obvious. Russia defining red lines, something of an irony there. But there are historic relationships between Iran and Russia, and therefore Russia is obliged to say something. Absolutely, yes. Now, that said, what is Russia's position? Russia is in a rather difficult position. It has, on the one hand, helped Iran, and on the other hand, it has been helped by Iran. So the advantages have been for both parties. But right just now, I don't think that Russia is really in any position to dictate anything, but at the same time feels absolutely obliged to comment.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's include Mr. Mick Napier in this debate. Mr. Mick, the New York Times and Wall Street Journal report that U.S. military analysts were caught off guard when Iran hit Diego Garcia, that is 4,000 kilometers away. This isn't just a symbolic strike, according to them. It's a capability that changes the strategic map, if we come to look at it. Meanwhile, we learned that Israeli strikes on Iran's South Pars gas field, which powers 80% of Iranian homes, were reportedly done without full U.S. presidential knowledge. Now, who is driving this bus? Is Benjamin Netanyahu dragging the United States into a regional war to secure its foreign allies' energy monopoly, perhaps, while America picks up the bill and the diplomatic isolation?
Well, you can only really tell the relationship between Israel and the USA when their interests and if their interests diverge. It seems as if, well, I think we know that Netanyahu has been pushing for a regime change war, an attack on Iran for a very long time, and previous presidents resisted that push. They may have had some sense that this would be a quagmire, a Middle Eastern Vietnam. So they were quite prepared to impose terrible sanctions to cause immense suffering to the people of Iran, but they balked at the idea of a bombing campaign or boots on the ground. They knew better. Netanyahu maintained the pressure with Trump, and I mean, it's easy to comment on Trump. It does seem to be unhinged. His, just basic language coming from anyone else would make you question his sanity. But there's a rationality to it because America uses Israel, and Israel's happy to be used, as an attack dog in the region that can be relied upon to chastise any state that displeases the USA. Israel was actually marginal to Western calculations. Before 67, as one of your guests said, Eisenhower drove Israel out of Egypt, or at least out east of the canal, and drove out Britain and France. But that was a different period. After 67, after Israel showed that it could crush Arab nationalism, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, if you look at the graph of American aid to Israel, it's pretty flat until 67, and then it turns up towards the roof. Aid increased massively, not at a time when the Jewish state was vulnerable in its earlier periods, but when it was invulnerable for a period. So the aid is not conditioned by sympathy for Israeli citizens or the state. It was only dispersed in vast amounts when Israel proved that it could be a cop on the beat. And that was strengthened when the other cop on the beat, the Shah of Iran, was overthrown in 79. And so until now, the American interest has lain in having a strong Israel, which can seize a part of Syria a long time ago, seize another part recently, attack its neighbors repeatedly, and carry out a genocide. So who's in the driving seat? I think it's a vehicle with two driving wheels, and so far they're going in the same direction. That may change because Trump certainly sees Israel as a strategic asset in the region, but failure is a terrible thing. And it looks like the Americans and the Israelis made a gigantic miscalculation in thinking that they could decapitate the regime, slaughter a sufficient number of people, bombing hospitals, schools, etc., and drive the people into the sort of, to feel the pain that it's inflicting on Cuba and Venezuela and other places, to rise up against their government. That has not happened. And the other gigantic miscalculation, which is very understandable, was to miscalculate the nature of the Iranian people and the Iranian government. But you know, look at the situation from Washington. I mean, one history lesson would be to look at when America last overthrew an Iranian government way back in '53, where they overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh government. They didn't, I mean, just like Trump, they spoke openly about doing it for plunder. It was for oil and to bring that oil under Western control. Quite naked, no dissimulation. That was the coup in '53. But you know, the following year, America did the same thing. A continent away, they overthrew a democratically elected government in Guatemala and launched a war of genocidal violence that lasted for a generation and which no one today could defend. So the view from Washington is they can do this. They can overthrow governments. Cuba is in their sights. Venezuela, they've drowned Central America in blood with multiple interventions, El Salvador and so on. So they think that they can do that. What happens is quite unusual. When they meet a nation and a people with some kind of revolutionary or very radical or very, you know, a regime based on a government based on mobilization. In Vietnam, they made a mistake. Why should they not believe they could easily defeat one of the poorest countries in the world? They didn't, they couldn't. They were crushed. They won every battle, but they lost the war. That's Vietnam. Afghanistan, for God's sake. Was it 2 trillion or 4 trillion? I just forget how much they spent in 20 years. But the Afghans with RPGs and mopeds drove them out. Technologically far inferior. Americans are treated to innumerable films about their brave soldiers in Afghanistan and tales of daring do, but they were beaten, roundly beaten, and fled, just as they did in Vietnam. But you know, they were totally shocked because they generally succeed in throwing their weight around. And when they encounter a government and a people like the Iranians, say, my God, why can't you be like the Venezuelans? Why can't you be like the people of Grenada, you know, who we walk in and overthrow? But they're not. And the Americans have miscalculated because terrorism only works when it succeeds, when it intimidates. But if the intended victim is not intimidated, then the whole calculus changes. And the Iranians have a lot of cards to play. They can wreck the world economy. Trump will be overthrown if that happens, and other governments will topple as well. But the Iranians have at their disposal not just a missile arsenal that can strike the Israeli nuclear bomb manufacturing area, but also the fact that geography has blessed them with the control of the Straits of Hormuz, and that geography is difficult to move. So when the Americans try to get the British, for God's sake, even the British who run alongside the Americans at every occasion, but when they ask the British and the French and the Germans and the Greeks, please not help us to open the Straits of Hormuz, we want you to do it while we watch. Of course, they all say no. They're quite prepared to suck up to Trump, but they're not prepared to commit suicide or political suicide. So we see the results of this gigantic miscalculation, both militarily, socially, and economically. And I think Trump is on the ropes. And the reason why he sounds increasingly deranged is that he simply doesn't know what to do.
Thank you.
Let's enjoy this. Let's enjoy this.
All right, let's include Mr. Chesovsky. Mr. Chesovsky, how would you put it? How does the U.S. plan to negotiate a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz amid these threats, exchanges between the U.S. and Iran? Are we really looking at a genuine negotiation to reopen the strait, or a coercive standoff where military deterrence and economic pressure matter more than diplomacy?
Right. Well, I wouldn't say they necessarily matter more than diplomacy, but certainly they go hand in hand. I mean, in terms of the U.S. applying both military and economic tools of pressure to drive the diplomatic negotiations, but obviously Iran has its own tools to bear, as well as we've been discussing. So I think this is basically framing the negotiation process. Right now, we're in an active state of war, so those negotiations are happening on the battlefield. They're happening in a very, obviously a very acute hybrid dimension with, energy and other form of critical infrastructure being attacked within Iran, although that's, pulled back now at least on the part of the U.S. And Iran has had its significant sort of responses throughout the Gulf region and, of course, in the Strait of Hormuz. So it's these levers that are being brought to bear for the negotiation process. We'll have to see, obviously, in terms of the goals of the United States, of the Trump administration. It hasn't been entirely clear, and there's been several objectives that have been thrown out, ranging from regime change, which seems more and more difficult, as we've seen in terms of the Iranian regime's ability to withstand this pressure, to other issues such as the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, and so on and so forth. So this was something that Trump had referenced in his comments, earlier today about getting a deal, and that the nuclear issue being a part of that deal. So perhaps revising or somewhat downgrading that regime change objective, but certainly we'll continue to see military and economic tools, leverage, and pressure being brought to bear by both sides in order to come to some kind of agreement, but we're probably not quite there yet.
But then how would you think that Iran actually would trust the United States when it says that it's going to negotiate? Although we had an incident before, I mean, they struck them while they were in the middle of negotiations, actually, and we had reports that they were going well. And then all of a sudden we had those strikes, and hence the crisis we're in.
Sure. Well, yeah, I certainly don't think that there's, much trust to lose between both sides out of the U.S. or Iran. So I think this is where we're going to see kind of the more concrete, the more tangible elements drive that negotiation process. Obviously, the U.S. Now one of the key objectives is to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, given all of the economic, fallout that we've been seeing over the last few weeks. And the objective of the Iranian government is, I think, first and foremost, to stay in power. So there is some room in between those two objectives in order to strike some kind of agreement or deal. Like I said, we're still in a very active military phase, but driving those negotiations and driving an eventual deal will certainly not be trust out of either side, but an alignment, or at least an agreement in some overlapping objectives between the two, as well as the neighboring Gulf states, which are playing important mediator roles, as well as other countries like Egypt and Turkey, which are also playing intermediary roles. And then you have countries like the Europeans, Russia, China, all of which have important sort of stakes and interests in the region, especially in terms of reopening the strait. So I think that's what's going to be driving the negotiation more so than trust.
Thank you indeed. And back to you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. Based on what our distinguished guest was just saying regarding the possibility of reaching perhaps negotiations again, we still have this threat looming, although we have this 5-day truce, if we may call it. And also we have this warning from former President Bill Clinton, who raised profound legal questions under the Geneva Conventions about targeting power plants serving 90 million people, hospitals, water treatment, homes. And also we have Senator Chris Murphy calling it a war crime if executed, although we still have the possibility. After 5 days, we don't know whether Donald Trump would actually dare and go and execute his threat. And yet we see the U.S., threatening exactly that, although now delayed by 5 days by Trump, we have a legal perspective to look at, let's say, from an international law perspective. Dr. Hamoud Salhi, what is the West defending anymore if this happens? A rules-based order or a might makes right order, where the only rule is that Israel cannot be touched?
And that has been the biggest injustice we've seen in many, many decades, centuries. What you've seen in Gaza, the injustices that are portrayed against the Palestinians. It's a historical genocide that will stay sort of marked in history books by the failure of the world to stand to right. But when you address the issue of might makes right, we have to put in a perspective. And part of it, number one, is under a unipolar system where the United States has been dominant power militarily, strategically, all of that. The United States has been able to impose its order, but this did not come out of just a vacuum. What we've seen after 9/11, that there is a shift of focus in who sort of directs what drives American foreign policy. We've seen a shift into this idea of hard power, where a Pentagon becoming the driving force of American foreign policy. You could see this, for example, the intervention in Afghanistan, the occupation of Iraq, but more than anything else, how the embassies overseas, and you could see this, even the embassies in Algeria, the American embassies in Algeria, and for that matter, the biggest embassy in the world in Iraq, which is really more of a barricade or more of a place where you can't get to it without security. That's far from what you've seen in the past, where the American cultural centers, the American embassy, you literally could walk into those facilities with no issue. Because at the time, the United States promoted its image through soft power, through diplomacy, through American values. We have not seen that. We have not seen that for a long time. When you look at the funding that are cut to USAID and the funding Fulbright, all of those programs that are designed to make America sort of wanted in the world are all gone, and as more so these days than in the past. But then connected to that is also the American geopolitical spheres. We've seen also in recent decades a shift to what was traditionally spheres belong to certain groups or certain continents, particularly Africa. For decades after the Second World War, Africa was seen as the sphere of the European geopolitical area. The United States was there not to intervene, to respect the French, the British, whoever has the authority there. But then came 2005, where Dick Cheney came to power and started to look at Africa, which they did in the past as well, but more from a strategic perspective, the oil resources, and declared, Dick Cheney at the time, that the African oil is a strategic commodity. And that lived up or raise the value of the African oil to the same level as that of the Gulf countries, which means a threat against the depletion of this oil or threats to control that oil will be seen as an intervention against American interests. In fact, in the archives that were sort of made public, that during the Cold War, United States had one of its plans in the late 50s that if the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, would to take the oil of the Gulf countries, they would actually, United States will put fire into it, that they will burn it and to deny it to the Soviet Union at the time. That same mentality is now applied to Africa, and then add to the fact that now you have a center, an AFRICOM, that its business is to deal, to handle the African security. And all of this, we're sort of in that perspective with military is what makes the United States protect its order. And finally, just a brief example, just in Africa, in the last decade or so, you have more than 30 military bases established there. Compare that to what the Chinese are doing, or even for that matter, to a small degree, with the Russian or other European countries where there is emphasis on what you call soft power. So the United States has lost that sort of interest in promoting American values through the use of soft power, democratic values, and things like that. By shifting to the American board, this idea might make rights, and with President Donald Trump and before him George W. Bush, you have this idea that military supremacy, it drives American interests. That might fit with certain school of thought. I get it, but realistically, it leads us to this world of order where America uses its veto right when it matters to Israel, when it matters to protect Israel, or when it matters to its national interest. So even when we put it back to this context today, I mean, America, how many violations of international law we heard? I mean, you're going to, you attacked, you killed leaders. That's a crime by international law. Now you're threatening to take control of another state's intervention in the national sovereignty of another state. That's another violation. And what are we talking about? We're talking about whether the United States can be successful, whether this will impact international order, our pricing, the oil prices, and things like that. So the international order, when it matters to the big powers, and I would say should correct that, when it matters to Israel and the United States, the world has treated these countries differently. Perhaps the United States forced itself, but the world, the international institution, all of that, let the United States get away with it.
Mm-hmm. And I get back to you, Mr. McNapier. Might make right. That is the question. So, on how many fronts can the USA focus? I mean, we still have the issue going on in Ukraine, and we know that the USA has been actually drained. And according to Donald Trump, they've been spending billions of dollars to help Ukraine in their war. And now we have this issue in Iran that is, escalating by the day and by the minute. Now, can the USA go with that strategy of might make right and succeed?
First of all, the USA has always gone with a strategy of might makes right. I mean, you have to laugh at Bill Clinton criticizing Trump for breaches of international law. Just a calculation on the back of an envelope, I reckon under Clinton, the USA invaded or bombed about half a dozen or even more countries. One thing they did do under Clinton was to bomb a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan, Ashifa, which some experts calculated resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of Sudanese women who couldn't have access to painkillers and so on. So every American president if they had been subjected to the same criteria as were applied at Nuremberg in 45, would be hanged. Because all of them have committed what Trump has now committed, which is a war of aggression. That is a war where you attack another country which is not an immediate threat. And at Nuremberg, they made the point that aggressive war was the greatest of all crimes because it contained within it the seeds of every other crime against humanity. And that's what America's doing with Iran. But who should be surprised? Look, there is no fall from grace. Trump is a monster, of course, but he's not radically different in his treatment of countries than his predecessors, all of whom carried out aggressive war, sometimes genocidally violent wars, like in Vietnam or in Afghanistan. So there's nothing new here. Now, can Trump cope in the present situation? Well, it would seem no. If you ask Zelensky, he'll certainly say no, because he feels abandoned here. He's trying to make himself relevant again, because America putting all this effort, stripping missiles from South Korea, and I think from Europe as well, if I'm not mistaken, and sending them to Israel, suggests that he's beginning to get to the limit of American resources. But look, it's not even if the NATO Russia-Ukraine war were to end, or we could forget about it for a moment, just as a mind experiment. The fact is that America would not be able to cope with a single front because they've blundered. They've walked into a situation which they thought would be a walkover. You know, you remember when the Americans invaded Iraq together with my own government and others, I think it was Cheney, and perhaps it was another one, who said they would be greeted with flowers from the rooftops. You know, the empire doesn't try to understand its colonies or even its targets. It doesn't study them in depth to look at weaknesses and potential disasters. If they had done that, they would never have followed the Soviet Union and invaded Afghanistan. They would have learned in page 2 of any book that Afghanistan's the easiest country in the world to invade. You just never get out. It's always a disaster. You're driven out and massacred. So they don't study. They don't try to learn about a place that they go to violate. And Iran is a disaster for them. Even without a drain towards Ukraine, there is no way. There's no way that significant negotiations can take place unless you think the Iranians are complete fools, and they will once again enter into negotiations while America prepares to bomb them again. Mm-hmm. But it's even deeper than that. America has taken Israel as to be virtually a part of the USA in terms of military, economics, and so on. And that is an expansionist regime. It's committing an ethnic cleansing, murdering tens of thousands of children, adults, and so on, exterminating hospitals, and ready to seize some of Lebanon, some of Syria, and who knows, maybe they'll topple Jordan at one time, in the view of the some of the more extreme right-wing politicians in Israel. So it's a very expansionist regime. It's hated by the populations across the region. You can live in Amman or Abu Dhabi, and you can switch on the TV, and you'll see what Israel's doing. It's not hidden. Mm-hmm. The regimes are allied with Israel, but the mass of the people absolutely hate the regime, and that's the danger. So America's backing Israel to police the region. Israel cannot police it on its own. The Iranians said, okay, if we make a deal with America, if America's taken out of the equation, we can handle Israel on our own.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed. Pretty point clear. So since you mentioned the regional neighbors, the countries, let me include Mr. Maklo, but this time shift a little bit to security. So Mr. Maklo, the UAE has been hit by over 2,000 missiles and drones. Oman, usually neutral, has been targeted. The Gulf monarchies are being attacked, but seem, for now, condemned to passivity of some sort. So you analyze risk for cooperations. How do you assess the U.S. security umbrella when it costs $2 billion for a radar system that gets destroyed, and then the guarantor, the very guarantor of security, is the very party that started a war destabilizing your ports? Isn't this the end of the U.S. being seen as a reliable security partner in the Gulf?
Right. Let's go with order. And a little bit later on, I'd like to link a comment to what Dr. Napier just said in regards to the masses of the people, because this is, I think, a rather important consideration when we are talking about what the future of the US presence in the Gulf states is actually going to be about. So anyway, it's not the end of the US security role, but it is most certainly a moment of reassessment. So, I mean, basically, what the Gulf states, and importantly, the citizens, repeat, the citizens of the Gulf states are seeing very, very clearly is that, yes, even the most advanced systems can be overwhelmed. No real surprise there, but people expected something a little bit different. So basically, the US security guarantees are by no means absolute. In fact, they're not even reliable in the most basic of fashions. So again, let's go by order. From a risk perspective, this does change behavior. So the Gulf states won't abandon the USA. That's absolutely impossible. They're so incredibly interlocked with the United States of America, in particular as regards defense. In terms of procurement, who's my major supplier? In terms of technology, who's my major partner, etc. So be extremely difficult from a defense point of view to uncouple yourself as a Gulf state from the USA. So that's not going to happen. But what will happen is that the states will start hedging. They'll start building into the equation redundancy. They will begin. Well, they have actually already begun diversifying partnerships, but this will be increased. And they will start to invest a lot more in their own capabilities. And there we go back to the new partners, etc. So in terms of defense, things will change quite radically there. So there is still a basic security umbrella, a US security umbrella, but as we've seen, it's anything other than sufficient. And this has been very, very well understood due to the simple fact that we've seen the results. The US security umbrella is not protecting the Gulf states. End of story. Now, I'll link that to what Mick Napier mentioned earlier on about the masses of the people. So, your question, how can the Gulf, the big question for me now is how can the Gulf states' leaders continue to justify the US presence in their territories when said US presence was always tied to the concept of the US will defend us. We have common enemies. The US will come to our aid. So the deal was always very much a case of we allow them to be here physically because they defend us. We allow the military bases. We allow the presence of US military, etc., because they defend us. Now that has been completely upturned, not only because the USA has been unable to defend the Gulf states, but it was the USA that started an absolutely absurd war in the Gulf states' very own garden. So this is something quite incredible indeed. So a major problem in the future will be how do I deal with a population that has seen that the traditional excuse for allowing the US presence in the territory simply is untenable. It's no longer something that has any sense. As I said, not only are you unable to defend us, but you actually started a war that's creating massive problems. Our ports are being hit, our energy structure is being hit, our energy production facilities are being hit, our desalination plants are being hit, etc., etc. This is not going in the right direction at all. And one future consideration, and here I'll close, is what are we now going to explain to the citizens?
Thank you indeed. Let me get back to Mr. Chesovsky on this very point. Mr. Chesovsky, if you were in the shoes of the people in the Gulf countries, would you actually be disappointed by the billions of dollars that you have spent for you to have some kind of safe, let's say, environment, a security that protects your investment and your infrastructure, and yet again it's failing? Would you think, or would you rather, as someone in the Gulf, maybe realign yourself, go towards some kind of new realignment, economically speaking or politically speaking? Well, it seems that we have lost the connection with Mr. Chesovsky, so let me redirect this question to Mr. Napier.
It's a very good question. They are between a rock and a hard place. Your other guest points out the degree of integration, I would say subordination, to the needs of the US economy, but which also meet the needs of the Gulf elites, is extreme. But you know, America is very far away and thinking of focusing a continent away, and Iran's very near. It's absolutely fascinating to me that Iran has not lashed out, but attacked facilities in the Gulf countries, in Saudi Arabia, etc. But Saudi hasn't struck back. The UAE has not struck back. And why? I think there's a well-founded fear that they don't know how this is going to end. And if it ends with an Iranian victory, however we define that, but the regime survives, if it ends in an Iranian victory, they're only a very short distance from Iran, and obviously they can't rely on the USA. So it's the dog that didn't bark, and you have to ask why. It's the missiles that didn't fire from Riyadh towards Tehran, and the reason why, I think, tells us something profound, that these regimes, whatever they say, whatever their bluster, must be thinking they may need to recalculate their links to Iran from, in some cases, bitter outright hostility or pretending friendship to something a little bit closer to alignment with Iran, or at least not openly aligning militarily with the USA. I think one of the Iranian goals of this war, of their response to the attack, is to remove American bases from the region, because the Iranians cannot just accept a ceasefire and then wait for another attack by Israel sometime down the road. So there's everything to play for here, but I don't see very much room for negotiations at all. That's not a positive, optimistic thing to say. But I think that's where we are. This is not something where Trump could meet over the last couple of days with representatives and sort it all out. That's a fantasy. These are deep, profound structural problems, and I just don't see how they can be negotiated away.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Napier. Since Mr. Chesovsky is back with us, we established the connection with him again. I would rather catch up on the question I asked you earlier. Mr. Chesovsky, we were saying that if you were in the shoes of any citizen in the Gulf countries and you see the U.S. security umbrella failing to protect you, and we have these huge risks and threats against your infrastructure, against water treatment plants and so on, after having spent billions of dollars, wouldn't you be disappointed? Or would this open some kind of, let's say, the opportunity or the possibility for realignment in the Gulf countries, be it either backing perhaps other superpowers, or just form some kind of an Arab NATO where they would stand with the U.S. and, fight Iran back?
Sure. Well, I think certainly right now is a time for all of the Gulf countries to reassess their relationships and reassess the strategic environment. I think a lot of things that had been assumed have been certainly challenged, not least of which is the extent and the speed at which Iran basically attacked their own energy and critical infrastructure, in some cases even civilian targets throughout the Gulf region, which is a clear departure from the previous rounds of fighting that we've seen between Israel, the U.S., and Iran going back to last year and even 2 years ago before that. Now, I will also say that while they are reassessing, I still think that in many ways the U.S. is still going to be the most viable option for many of these Gulf countries in terms of their broader security alignment. Other countries could play more of a role, but they bring with them their own challenges here. I'm thinking about, countries like Russia or China, and certainly the Gulf countries themselves have been, quite outspoken about Iran's direct attacks on them as well. Now, increasing regional collaboration, that's definitely, an option as well. But I think there will need to be some level of, military backing, whether in terms of defenses, weapon supplies, and things of that nature. So certainly it's one that's caused a reassessment, I think rightfully so, amongst the Gulf countries, but not only for the relationship with the U.S., but also that with Iran and the other players in the region.
Mm-hmm. And now, how much would it cost, for this war to continue? If we see, for example, Donald Trump, executing his threats and hitting Iran, definitely Iran is not going to just stand there and watch and execute its threat as well on targeting those very infrastructure that the Gulf countries are trying to protect. But then Iran would have an excuse. They say that you have American bases that are attacking us. And what would be, let's say, the ultimate response from the Gulf countries if this happens?
Right. So I mentioned before that part of the Trump administration strategy or policy has been, whether it's on the domestic front or certainly on the international front, to push against the boundaries as much as possible, but at the same time to be responsive to the constraints when they're felt, very acutely. And I think we're in the process of seeing that now, first with that threat from, a few days ago about striking the power plants. Iran issued its response, which would basically be to respond in kind against Gulf countries. And I think that cost would be simply just too much, of course, for the region, but also for the U.S. and for the global economy to bear, which is why I think that we've seen Trump walk back a little bit, or at least float this 5-day period for negotiations to take place. We saw some similar activities. I should mention, for example, when the Trump administration and Trump himself was, actively seeking to acquire Greenland, we saw a number of different constraints, a number of different forces push back, both on the domestic political front within Congress, obviously from the European countries, such as Denmark and other NATO allies. But even the market reaction was a major constraint as well, when Trump was threatening either military action or things like tariffs and trade restrictions. So when those forces culminate, the administration has proven, that it's willing to sort of pivot and take a step back. And that's, I think, what we're seeing right now, because I think that cost, if that threat were to be fully implemented, and Iran would have the ability to retaliate, I think would take this conflict, as as tragic as it has been, as disruptive as it has been, to a whole different level. So here is where I think we see those material constraints really making themselves felt, and now Trump looking for, at least for the time being, some kind of diplomatic off-ramp. That doesn't mean that some military action and strikes won't continue in some form, but I think going after entire power plants and taking those entirely offline would just invite too much disruption and too many significant consequences for that type of action to be taken without serious consideration and collaboration with partners in the region.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of partners, and since you mentioned NATO, Mr. Chesovsky, NATO is saying that it's implementing a vision to secure the Strait of Hormuz. Now, but is this really something that is going to be limited? A limited mission to protect navigation? Or can we think of it as an early stage of maybe a way more broader conflict?
I think it would be limited to opening the Strait of Hormuz if it in fact were to occur. I know that the NATO Secretary General mentioned that those deliberations have been ongoing for the last couple of weeks. Even countries outside of NATO, like Japan, have mentioned that they could be potentially involved, but this is in a less kind of active, kinetic environment than we're seeing right now, because the risks are simply too high for such countries to participate in any significant way. I mean, I think this is part of why we're seeing even such operations to reopen the strait has a lot of hesitation, because of the concern of whether it's NATO allies, whether it's the US allies in the Indo-Pacific, that this could pull them into a broader conflict, which I think very few countries are interested in at this point. So I do think that right now, that if there were to be some kind of operation, it would have a very limited objective. But even that, we're seeing some challenges and some hesitation to go even that far for such a international operation.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of hesitations, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, given Tehran's rhetoric that we keep hearing in action so far, how might Iran, according to you, respond to any NATO-linked security measures?
So what we're hearing, or what we're seeing, is Iran is open to any solution that would be in line with guaranteeing long-term security. The Iranians don't want to be in the same place as they were back in June 25. And so they are entertaining the proposal about sharing some kind of control provided of Hormuz, provided that they will be in control of that, meaning the revenues will be sort of shared, or sort of there will be some kind of solution there. They are open to that, and that's sort of one of the compromise that they are seeking. But at the same time, what's important to them, to the Iranian, is the security sort of guarantees. The Iranians know that they have the leverage. Just as Gamal Abdel Nasser, we said earlier, had the leverage, they know very well that they had the leverage, and they know that this is their best position. This is a moment where they need to stay firm and dictate the rules on others, so to protect their national interests. A NATO intervention, from my perspective, the way I look at it, is it could be out of discussion, but what is possible is perhaps a friendly force of certain countries, or even a United Nations Security Council, something like that. But the Iranian will not move without getting guarantees that they are safe, and that include protecting their ballistic missile, especially the ballistic missile. They know very well that this is what kept them going. Otherwise, they would have been, defeated. So they have the leverage, and they are willing to pursue it.
Thank you indeed. And now, another question that is raised, Mr. Chizovsky, if this NATO intervention happens, would you think in any way whatsoever it would lead to a direct confrontation between major powers, especially that I have asked this question about to Mr. Maklo about, Russia setting red lines there?
Well, I would say that in the type of environment that we're at right now, nothing can be completely excluded. However, I will say it's quite highly unlikely that we would see a direct confrontation, whether you're talking about Russia, certainly China as well. These are countries that have in various ways supported Iran, whether it's economically or even in security matters, but I think will fall far short of entering this conflict in a direct military capacity. We've also seen that same situation unfold in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Certainly, a lot of indirect support from warring sides, but the risks, I think, for all parties involved, whether it's for the U.S., for Russia, for others, outweigh the interests in order to get involved in such a conflict. Obviously, nuclear weapons being a major factor, but also their respective, focus on their more immediate kind of peripheries. Russia, obviously, with the Ukraine conflict, China with elements like Taiwan. So these are, countries that I think are actually trying to mitigate the potential fallout of this conflict, both regionally and globally, rather than seeking to enter it in a direct way and confront the United States directly at this moment in time.
And now, Mr. Maklo, I might have asked this question earlier to Mr. Chizovsky, but I would like to have your stance on this when it comes to this escalation. Would you think this escalation could lead to a redrawing of alliances, not just in the Gulf countries, but maybe in the global South in general, not just politically, but economically as well?
Certainly, yes. Not dramatically, not overnight. But what we will see is a gradual rebalancing of alliances. Rebalancing and also a series of ruptures. Political lines are certainly being redrawn. Let me just open close very quickly a parenthesis. 3 years ago, back in, if I'm not wrong, March of 2023, following a few days of very, very secretive and absolutely unannounced talks in Beijing, two very bitter rivals, Saudi Arabia and Iran, signed a rather surprising deal whereby they would restore diplomatic relations very, very quickly, within a few months. So this is an example of how political relations and relationships are changing. This is also an example of China's expanding and ever more powerful role on the global stage. Now, moving to the USA, we have a big issue here, and it's very, very simple. Unfortunately, the USA is no longer credible. Not only did it not defend the Gulf states, but it dragged them into conflict that they didn't want. Not only did the United States of America walk away from negotiations with Iran, which, according to others, non-Iranian and non-American sources who were present, were negotiations that were actually going in the right direction. But then again, it's also very, very difficult to believe that the United States of America entered into said negotiations in an honest manner. I mean, who would send an unqualified son-in-law and a completely unqualified former business partner, real estate mogul, into negotiations on nuclear issues with a country the size of Iran? I mean, let's be serious. Now, if you're going to negotiate such an important issue, who do you send? People who are going to improvise, people who have no qualifications, people who may very, very well be very good at building a hotel or pushing through a real estate deal? Or do you send somebody who actually comes from a diplomatic background, who actually has several decades of experience? You're not serious. So the United States of America, terribly sorry, and terribly sorry indeed, right just now has, if not zero credibility, less than zero credibility. Now, that is something that has not gone unnoticed, and it is something that a great number of countries, including middle powers, who you mentioned earlier on, the concept of soft power in Africa, one of your guests spoke about Russia, China, etc. Think of Turkey as a rising middle power, Turkish presence in Africa, which is expanding by the day, which we're ignoring. But I digress. Let me get back to the point. Other countries and other powers will, step by step, begin to substitute the United States of America. I think it's as simple as that. When you have a country that, in Nick Napier earlier on used the phrase "work it out on the back of an envelope." What we find ourselves in today is a scenario that was absolutely predictable, that could have been designed on the back of an envelope, on the back of a fag packet, on the back of a bus ticket. The space available on the back of a bus ticket was more than significant to define exactly what would happen when the American president decided that he would attack Iran. So we're living through an absolutely incredible. I mean, this is absolutely incredible. And, very soon it'll be the 1st of April, April Fool's Day. It's going to be very, very difficult for anybody to invent an April's Fool joke, because anything and everything is credible today. But again, I digress. I go back to the point. Economically, moving on from politically, a number of the Gulf states have already been deepening ties with Asia, and in particular China and India, because, well, apart from the fact that there's, that's where a lot of demand is coming from and where potential for long-term growth actually is, while at the same time maintaining links with US and Europe. But everybody is diversifying. And this process of diversification is going to be rapidly accelerated given what's happened over the past month. So the future for the Gulf states is not so much about replacing one partner with another. It's about building multiple parallel relationships to reduce dependency on any single actor. And the single actor in this case is the United States of America when it comes to defense, and plenty of other partners on other fronts. But this is a very deliberate strategy that has been enacted, implemented over the past few years, but it's now going to witness an absolute massive acceleration, because times have changed and there is no going back to where we were at the beginning of the year 2026.
Thank you indeed. Now, Mr. Napier, when it comes to people, the average citizen, with millions already affected by rising food and fuel prices, is the world prepared for a new wave of humanitarian crisis triggered by this conflict if it goes way out of control?
Nothing. Structures are not in place, resources are not in place to deal with a worst-case scenario that's perfectly easy to envisage of economic collapse, mass migration, in one direction towards Europe or towards North America. But mass migration of a much higher magnitude than we've seen so far, which has plunged some European countries and also America, the USA, into a political crisis where people build a political reputation opposing and demonizing refugees. But what could be coming down the road is incalculable, because if oil gets to $150 or $200 a barrel, which people who know far more about oil economics than I do say is possible, the fact is, if that is ever achieved, or we ever reach that stage, the economic implications, the social implications will be incalculable. Prices will rise for basic foodstuffs beyond the reach of millions and tens of millions of people. So it's difficult to calculate, but we have to say that if Trump bombs bits of Iran, which propels the Iranians to remove water from the city of Riyadh through rocketing the desalination plants, or the United Arab Emirates, then it'll be a human catastrophe. I've lived in some of those cities. If there's no water, there's nothing. You can't stay there, and millions of people could be on the move. Now, that's a worst-case scenario, but it's easy enough to envisage it. If Trump bombs in a way that provokes the Iranians, a few missiles headed towards high-rise buildings and desalination plants in the UAE will be catastrophic. And this has already shifted the balance. The UAE and Saudi were bombing Yemen, bombing the Houthis in Yemen for, I think, 8 years, was it? 9 years, with the most advanced British weapons. British arms companies made a fortune out of this, but they failed. They were unable. But the question arises, now the Houthis must be looking at this to say, if anyone tries that again, the UAE and the Gulf monarchies are extremely vulnerable to a few missiles, not from a state as big, as large as Iran, but from something even much smaller. And I think, the Saudi and UAE adventures in Yemen point to something else. These militaries are extremely weak. If they can't deal with the Houthis in Yemen, they certainly can't deal with the Iranians. And the idea which is mooted, that the Gulf states should come together to form some kind of mini NATO on the Gulf, a military alliance, is not going to frighten anybody, because these countries don't have effective militaries. The UAE's got a population of 10 million, 1 million citizens. Much of their army is made up of mercenaries hired from Pakistan and elsewhere. That is very fragile indeed. And the fragility of those regimes has been revealed to an extent that I think exceeds most people's. It has actually shocked many of us who thought they were fragile, but my God, not as fragile as this.
But their fragility, Mr. Napier, affects the world as well, because they are in a very strategic place on the map. And here, Mr. Napier, how long before global institutions and international organizations just step in and say enough is enough?
But what can they do? I try to envisage, in the best possible outcome, a peace settlement. But anything that's acceptable to Iran, safety from repeated aggressions and assassinations, which Israel, by the way, has been carrying out of Iranians for 20 years, not just the most recent period, but anything that would satisfy the minimum needs of any Iranian government, I would say, will inflame Israel. Anything that satisfies it, I can't imagine what would satisfy Israel. But you take my point. Anybody who, if you're looking for an agreement, it strikes me that it's utterly impossible to reach a stable agreement given the current balance of forces in the Gulf. And however hard Trump blows to say that he's reached agreement on X, Y, and Z, the fact is Israel remains a genocidal, expansionist regime which reserves to itself the right to attack and kill and assassinate people extraterritorially, anywhere it chooses. And it's said already, not just the supreme leader and the top leadership in Iran, but if Israel says if they can identify anyone who's a significant figure in the Iranian political structure, they reserve the right to assassinate them. Now, you can't live in the same neighborhood as somebody like that. So once again, I say anything that's acceptable to Iran will defang Israel, and Israel will not be defanged easily.
Thank you indeed. And since we have reached the end of our coverage, I would like to give you a final word briefly to every single guest. Mr. Chesovsky, let's begin with you. How would you imagine the endgame scenario?
Sure. So I see two basically high-level scenarios that are most likely. One is a short-term, perhaps not resolution to the conflict, but we're starting to see the beginnings of at least some off-ramps that will likely not result in the Trump administration objective of regime change in Iran, but one that could address things like the nuclear issue, potentially the ballistic missile issue, and less likely, but still possible, on Iran's support of its various proxy groups. In that case, it would be an uneasy, settlement, but one that could at least reopen the Strait of Hormuz and lessen some of that regional instability. And then second is that this could drag on for several weeks, if not several months. I don't see it going beyond that, just simply because of the economic and political consequences. And this will be basically if the Iranian regime and if the U.S. and Israel are unable or unwilling to strike a deal, we'll see continued disruption and potentially some regional reverberations from this conflict. So hopeful that the former, that the first kind of scenario is more likely, but certainly the second one is quite possible at this time as well.
Thank you indeed. And Dr. Hamoud Salhi, very briefly, please, how do you see it yourself?
So we have these 5 days that we have to sort of wait, and even though the chances of reaching a solution could be far remotely, I think one scenario is we have to assume that limited occupation of the Hormuz or the islands is a failure. That will lead us right away to a major issue, which is the increased prices of oil, that the Iranian will push on having this issue becoming international. There will be more global pressure on it, and that's what they are bet on, which automatically will shift the discussion to the uranium. And that would be where the negotiation will be going, and that will be ending. So we will have sort of the administration, the Israelis and the Americans will leave with the notion that the Iranians could agree to certain control or allowing to share the control of the Hormuz by allowing the ships to move in and on and all that, and some kind of resolution to the uranium. I think that's where we're heading. But again, short of what will happen this week, which is really just a pause for Trump to prepare for other things.
Thank you indeed. And Mr. Mark Lowe?
Right. First and foremost, the big issue is, what does the United States of America actually want? And if the United States of America knows what it wants, will they actually stick to this objectives that we have as yet to fully understand? Now, at the risk of repeating what the other guests have said, I think very, very quickly, there are 3 potential scenarios. The first is containment. Escalation is managed. The conflict in some fashion stabilizes without expanding any further. But that presupposes some concrete form of diplomatic engagement. And here we have the complication, the one that I mentioned earlier, and also the fact that, looking specifically at Iran, there are signs and signals that leadership is a bit fragmented at the moment. So it's a little bit inconsistent. So a diplomatic solution, which is what everybody wants to see, might actually be a little bit difficult. Too many contradictory signs and signals. We have to see, we have to hope. The second scenario, second of the 3 basic scenarios, is prolonged instability, ongoing attacks, ongoing disruption, ever greater uncertainty, very little chance of any clear resolution, absolutely no ideas as to what timeframes could be. And the third and the worst is regional spillover. As your guest mentioned earlier on, the Gulf states until now have been very, very patient, very, very patient, but said patience can't last. So if there is no diplomatic resolution to this scenario, there is very much a risk of additional actors becoming directly involved, the conflict widening significantly, and a whole series of scenarios, such as other guests have mentioned, falling into place and creating, I don't like the word catastrophic situation, but something not short of an absolutely catastrophic situation.
Thank you indeed. And before we wrap up, I want to sincerely thank our distinguished panel for sharing their insights tonight. Mr. Eugene Chasovsky, thank you so much. Dr. Hamoud Salhi, I appreciate it. Mr. Mark Lowe, thank you so much. And Mick Napier, thank you indeed. Your expertise has helped make sense of a complex and a dangerous situation. We appreciate your time and analysis, and it has been an honor having you with us on All 24 News. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, have a good one.